Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Manta Trends webinar series. My name is Ivy Lamb, and I'll be your host for today's event, What Small Business Owners Need to Know About New Overtime Laws. If you're confused by overtime regulations, you're not alone. According to a recent Manta poll, a majority of small business owners aren't sure whether their employees are overtime exempt. In the same poll, 52% said they were unaware of the pending changes to overtime regulations. Since the Obama administration announced an update to the Fair Labor Standards Act in May, it's become even more pressing for small business owners to understand and comply with the law. During this webinar, we will walk you through the changes and the options available to you. Before we dive in, I want to cover some important housekeeping items. During the webinar, you should see a slide area, which will allow you to view the webinar. You'll also see 3 tabs: Ask a Question, Attachments, and Rate This. Click on the Ask a Question tab to submit a question at any time during the webinar. We'll do our best to respond during the Q&A at the end of the event. Under the Attachments tab, you'll find more resources related to today's topic. Go to Rate This to leave us feedback on the presentation, and you can tweet about today's event using the hashtag MantaTrends. If you're having technical difficulties, please email webinarhelp@manta.com. Now on to our presentation. I'm happy to introduce Manta CEO John Kuhnkicker. John brings more than 15 years of experience working with high-growth B2B and B2C companies, including Accenture, Hotwire, Switchfly, and Starwood Hotels and Resorts. As CEO, he leads Manta to strengthen its current offerings while expanding products and services for small business owners. John received a bachelor's degree in finance from Boston College. Today, we're going to talk about when the new overtime rule takes effect, who is affected, and what you can do to prepare. We'll also talk about why compliance matters so much, especially for small business owners. Now, I'll hand things over to you, John.
Thanks, Ivy. Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to take you through one of the largest changes in the market with the overtime rules. And the most important thing to know right out of the gate is the date that this takes effect, which is December 1 of this year, 2016. So obviously you want to make sure that you're ready to move forward. And what the change is it's related to the Fair Labor Standards Act, or the FLSA, which you've probably heard a lot about. And overall, there is an increase to the minimum wage at which an employee needs to be paid overtime depending on their categorization. It was around $23,000 since 1975, and as of this December, it moves up to just over $47,000. So from a weekly aspect, that's the difference of $455 today, moving up to $913 per week starting in December. So what is the Fair Labor Standards Act? Well, it's a federal law requiring employers in the U.S. to pay employees at least a federal minimum wage plus time and a half for hours worked beyond the standard 40-hour work week. And this came into place in 1938. The origins of it were to institute a 40-hour work week, and so that employers had to pay time and a half over this standard work week. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about what that means. Who's affected and how to find out if you are affected? Well, businesses have to have at least 2 employees and more than $500,000 in gross annual sales. And this affects specifically exempt employees and non-exempt employees. There are 2 different classifications. For exempt employees, which we'll go through, there are some ways to determine if you are exempt from overtime or if your employees are exempt from overtime. But really, there are 3 categories within this. There's an executive, an administrative, and a professional sales type of employee that would be exempt under certain conditions and would not be eligible for overtime pay. What's an overtime exemption, right? This is the big question as well. So exempt employees do not earn any overtime compensation, and they have to. There are two key components for this. These employees have to earn a minimum salary, and they have to pass a duties test, which if you go onto the Manta Academy, we have some classes that can go in a lot more detail on this in a longer period of time. But it again gets back to, are the duties of that employee related to typically what was classified as white collar, executive, administrative, or a professional salesperson. The change to the minimum salary is exactly attributed to this exempt employee status. So starting December 1st of 2016, the new minimum salary for overtime exempt workers is $47,476 annually, or $913 per week. So anyone under this level, even if it's just $46,000 annually, is now going to be eligible for overtime compensation, regardless of if they're salaried or not. That is the key change. What are your options for dealing with this? Well, first of all, from our study at Manta, our recent survey, we found out that just over 50% of you, about 52% of you, were not even aware of the change. So for a large percentage of the workforce and the small business owners, this is going to come as a surprise. So figuring out your options, the first step is to figure out who is an exempt and a non-exempt employee, which we'll get to in the next slide. Once you do that, you have three basic options. The first is to increase the salary of employees who meet the duties test for the new minimum. So if someone is close to that $47,476 annual compensation, you have the ability to increase that employee if they meet the duties tests, so they're no longer eligible for overtime. They would still be exempt. That's the first option. The second option is to pay employees for overtime hours, just as you do now for anybody below the $23,000 threshold. You have that option even with the increased compensation to pay employees for overtime, but just at a much different threshold. And then the third is to reduce or eliminate overtime hours for your workforce. So really, those are the options that you have as a small business owner or an employer, and you can figure out what the right combination of those is for you. What should you do? So the first thing again is conduct an employee audit. Determine who is exempt, who's not exempt, and how that can work. Second, you probably want to find an attorney or an HR consultant to help you determine policies that you can roll out in your workplace. Third, you're going to set and communicate those new policies across your business to make sure that everyone is clear so there's no confusion. And the fourth is really to manage your overtime costs with time tracking of part-time and contract workers. So time tracking of all workers, and then you can add a part-time workforce or contract workers as necessary. We have a lot more information on this as well in the Manta Academy if you want some specific tools that you can use for time tracking of your workforce. Why does it matter? Well, there's a legal and a financial risk, really. Violating the FLSA opens your business up to this. The penalties are you have to pay any employees that were to win a case against you back pay and attorney's fees. The attorney's fees in these cases, even if only a partial, even if a jury or a court only awards a partial victory to the employee that's suing an employer, you still often would have to pay all of the attorney's fees, and that's often larger and more substantial than the back pay, so something to consider. And really, I'll open it up to questions. Like, see, there's a lot already on this topic, but the key thing to remember is to kind of baseline where your organization is, where your company is, who fits into which buckets, and then get the professional help you need to roll out the policies for your company to make sure that people are handled correctly and that you're not opening yourself up to any kind of legal or financial risk. So with that, we can open it up, Ivy.
Great. Thank you so much, John, for covering all of that. I want to remind everyone that you can submit a question by clicking over to the Ask a Question tab, and we will answer them now to the best of our ability. So, John, can an employee be paid a salary and still have the right to earn overtime, or is it only hourly employees that earn overtime?
That's a great question, Ivy. Yes, definitely. An employee can be a salaried employee and still have to be paid overtime, especially if they fall below the $47,000, $476 annual salary. So whether you're $23,800 per year or $46,000 per year, that immediately disqualifies the worker from being an exempt worker. So going forward, the big difference for any employer is you may have had some of your workforce that was exempt and was making, let's say, $35,000 per year. As soon as this change goes into effect December 1st, that same worker would actually be eligible for time and a half compensation. So you have to figure out what their hourly comp is, their hourly pay is, and they would be eligible for every hour over 40 hours per week. That is a big change.
Mm-hmm. We have a question related to the piece of advice about using contract workers to try and manage cost. We have an attendee who's asking, can we legally limit time for contract workers, or how can we control this?
So the first thing I would advise in all these situations is to check with a local legal and or HR representative to make sure that your state guidelines as well as the federal guidelines are met. But I guess to make sure I understand the question, can we legally limit time for contract workers? One of the options that you have as a business owner is to use contract workers or part-time workers to augment any full-time staff that you have that may now fall below the exempt threshold. Meaning, if you have an employee that is below $47,000 but was above the $23,000 threshold that before was a salaried worker and fit all the categorizations, you can use contract workers as a way to not have to pay the time and a half to that same worker. But you'd have to limit that employee to 40 hours because they are still eligible for overtime pay if they work over 40 hours, regardless of if you're adding contract help or not. So the main thing that you would have to do in many of the cases now is if an employee is now non-exempt, whereas before they were exempt, you have to track their hours whether they're salaried or not. And that's a change you have to implement across your workforce.
Thanks, John. We're getting multiple questions around bonuses or commission and how those play into this new salary requirement.
Yeah, and that's something again. So the intention is really for salary for the $47,000 threshold, and it depends on the nature of your bonuses and how the compensation works with your specific employees. So I would check with a local legal HR rep to make sure. But the general rule here is salary. That is a salaried amount that is moved up, not total compensation only.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John. So we have someone asking, any employee who makes more than the $47,476 is not eligible for overtime as of December 1st?
Yeah, so that's an important distinction as well. That is not, it is not true just based on their $47,000 compensation doesn't mean that they are not eligible for overtime pay. It has to be both the compensation level and the characteristics of that worker and what their responsibilities are. So there's a whole set of workers, which again, I would encourage you to go to the Manta Academy on our site and look through some of the courses and obviously talk to an expert in your area. But especially what they had classified historically as, blue collar workforce, heavy labor, trucking, things like this. they would still be eligible for overtime pay, just as today, someone who's making $30,000 with the current $23,000 threshold may be eligible for overtime pay depending on their work classification, not just on their compensation. So both, it's not an if statement, or an or statement rather, it's and. Both their compensation and their responsibilities have to be a certain specific criteria in order for them to be an exempt worker.
Great. Well, unfortunately, it's about time for us to wrap up. We don't have time for any more questions, but as John has mentioned a few times, if you click over to the Attachments tab, you'll be able to go straight to our Academy course on overtime compliance, which takes a much deeper dive into this topic and is great for those of you that want to spend a little more time learning about overtime compliance. Also, if you'd like to revisit any part of this webinar, it will be available for on-demand viewing within 24 hours. Thank you again, John, so much for presenting today. Everyone, we hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and thank you for attending.
Thank you.